Welcome back to The Explainer. So today we're diving straight into the Panama Canal and really unpacking this massive story of sovereignty, scale, and global power. Because, this isn't just a waterway or some cool piece of engineering. We're going to explore this as a profound story of human sacrifice, layered cultural identities, and just raw geopolitical power.
To really grasp the scale of what we're talking about here, we've got to start with the number 85. When ships arrive at the canal, they're hit with an immediate problem. The canal isn't actually at sea level, right? To cross the continent, these colossal ships literally have to climb 85 feet up into the air. That is the equivalent of hauling a ship up an 8-story building. And I mean, we aren't talking about lifting speedboats here. We're talking about massive container ships carrying up to 14,000 cargo boxes. A single ship can weigh as much as 60,000 pickup trucks. Just think about that. The sheer awe-inspiring scale of the engineering required to lift that much weight into the air multiple times a single day is absolutely staggering.
Okay, so let's dive into how this actually works. Because solving this logistical nightmare is really what makes our modern global economy possible. I mean, the goods sitting in your living room right now likely pass through here. Without it, ships would have to take that incredibly long, treacherous journey all the way around the bottom of South America. The mechanics of this are absolutely fascinating. When a ship arrives at the locks, it basically enters this massive water elevator. But the crazy part? They don't use giant mechanical pumps or electricity to lift these megaships. Nope, they just use gravity and water from a dammed river that created this huge, elevated, man-made lake. They literally just open the valves, gravity floods the basin, and the water naturally lifts the ship 85 feet. It's this incredibly sophisticated operation, and it happens seamlessly every single day.
But, to truly understand this canal, we've got to shift our focus from all that engineering awe to a much more somber reality. We need to look at the blood, the sweat, and the real human cost that built this marvel. Because this wasn't just a triumph of machinery, right? It was forged through unimaginable sacrifice.
This is a story that builds over centuries. For hundreds of years, the Spanish used this narrow stretch of jungle as a transit trail. Then, in the late 1800s, the French tried to dig a canal, but tens of thousands of workers died, mostly from disease-carrying mosquitoes, and the whole project completely failed. Enter a rapidly expanding United States looking for a two-ocean navy. In 1903, the U.S. actually backed Panama's independence from Colombia, and the trade-off? The U.S. gained total control over this eternally important global choke point.
So, to actually dig the thing, the Americans brought in this massive global labor force. We're talking workers from Cuba, Germany, India, Barbados, China, Jamaica, Italy, Costa Rica. This incredible diversity ended up creating layers upon layers of different cultures, which really formed the rich foundation of modern Panamanian identity. But the reality on the ground for those workers was just brutal. We are talking about men working with pickaxes and dynamite in incredibly dangerous conditions, only to return to sweltering barracks. Thousands upon thousands of people died, leaving behind so many forgotten, unmarked graves. It took an almost impossible amount of effort to finally connect those two oceans by 1915.
Well, with the canal finally finished, U.S. global power absolutely surged. But we have to look at what happened to the land itself next. Because the United States didn't just build a canal. They occupied a 10-mile thick strip of land right through the dead center of this newly formed country.
And that created a really stark, divided reality. Inside the American Canal Zone, it was literally a segregated slice of America sitting on the 9th parallel. We're talking manicured lawns, bowling alleys, U.S. federal laws, the whole shebang. Meanwhile, outside the zone, and honestly even for the locals working inside it, Panamanians were treated as second-class citizens. The zone quite literally cut the country of Panama in half. It disconnected cities and completely expelled local towns that had been there for generations.
This bizarre setup created a really unique subculture known as the Zonians. These were generations of Americans born and raised right there in the Canal Zone, and there's this quote that hits the nail on the head. We live kind of in a limbo that's never been defined and is very quickly being forgotten. When they visited the U.S. mainland, they were seen as outsiders from Panama, but in Panama City, they were seen as American gringos. It was this tight-knit company town owned by the federal government, but, built entirely on someone else's soil.
So as decades passed, you can imagine local frustration really starting to boil over. Panamanians were looking at the backbone of their own country, this massive economic engine, and realizing they weren't even allowed to access it. This sparked a profound, deep-seated struggle for something much bigger. It became all about sovereignty.
At its core, sovereignty is simply the right to be attached to your land. completely free from domination by outside powers. It's the basic promise that a country is actually in charge of the land inside its own borders. Panamanians felt this deep, constant humiliation of being strangers in their own land. And reclaiming that space, that would become a long, unifying, and ultimately bloody fight.
That struggle intensified pretty quickly. It really kicked off in 1964 when students marched into the zone for one reason, just to plant a Panamanian flag. That sparked riots that tragically left 25 people dead. Eventually, in the late 1970s, US President Jimmy Carter signed a treaty to gradually hand the canal back. But right in the middle of this handover process in 1989, there was a massive disruption. The US actually invaded Panama. Ultimately, though, by 1999, the handover was completely finished, officially erasing the American Canal Zone from the map.
Actually, let's pause on that 1989 invasion for a second because it really proves that empires do not let go of strategic choke points easily. When the Panamanian dictator defied Washington, the US invaded with tens of thousands of troops. Neighborhoods were bombed, leading to heavy civilian casualties. And get this, when the dictator fled to the Vatican embassy, US troops surrounded the building and literally blasted hard rock music from giant speakers 24/7 just to force his surrender. It was a massive trauma for the country, and it sent a crystal clear message. The US might be handing over the canal, but they still held the real power.
Fast forward to today. The canal zone is gone. The canal itself is run beautifully by Panamanian engineers, and a lot of those former US military bases are now startup incubators and art installations, which is cool. But Panamanian sovereignty is actually once again caught right in the crosshairs. Now, what's really interesting here is that the modern friction all goes back to the fine print of that original handover treaty. It explicitly states that the US retains the right to act unilaterally to reopen the canal if its neutrality is threatened. That single clause, right there, is the absolute linchpin of the current tension we're seeing between the US, China, and Panama.
So here's how that geopolitical friction is playing out right now. A company based in Hong Kong currently manages vital ports at both the Pacific and Caribbean entrances of the canal. Recently, the Trump administration cited this as a violation of the canal's neutrality, arguing it basically gave the Chinese government way too much influence over a critical global trade route. In response to that, the US signed agreements to send troops, military helicopters, and funding to reactivate former American bases in the area.
As you might guess, this sudden return of US military influence has definitely alarmed a lot of locals. One Panamanian politician directly described these recent maneuvers as a camouflaged invasion, an invasion without firing a shot, but with a cudgel and threats. For a nation that spent an entire century fighting to erase foreign military bases from its map, seeing them return under heavy diplomatic pressure feels a whole lot like history repeating itself. And that brings us to the dual realities facing Panama today. On one hand, the canal is threatened by external forces, right? It's caught in this massive geopolitical tug-of-war between the US and China. But locals will be the first to tell you that the internal threats are just as severe. There's deep, widespread frustration with domestic corruption, where political elites hoard the massive wealth generated by the canal, completely failing to share that abundance with the very people who fought and died to reclaim it. The Panama Canal is, without a doubt, an unbelievable triumph of engineering. It physically connects our world and keeps our global economy running. But when a single waterway holds that much strategic and financial power, can it ever truly belong to just one nation? Will Panama ever achieve the absolute sovereignty it sacrificed so much to win? It's an incredibly complex question and definitely one to keep in mind the next time you see a shipping container rolling down the highway. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.